Thank you, and welcome back, I suppose. My first time with you, but I did want to touch on a couple of issues maybe that have not been addressed yet. The FCC, as you know, has an important role in the lives of Americans. It is an independent agency, of course, with the stated mission of overseeing and improving our communication system. But beyond those stated goals, the FCC also plays an important role in safeguarding some of our most important and fundamental rights. The FCC ensures that our nation maintains the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The First Amendment, I really believe, is our pressure release valve as a country to speak your mind. And the FCC is crucial in ensuring Americans can express themselves, agree, disagree, and ensure dissent is protected. In carrying out the agency's duties, the FCC ensures that we're able to connect with friends and family, but also exercise our fundamental rights of freedom of speech and hear differing viewpoints. An FCC commissioner must commit himself or herself to these noble goals. And commissioners should work with Congress to protect Missourians and every American's right to freedom of speech. Our republic simply cannot endure if we decide that only certain individuals or certain viewpoints can be heard, silenced, or censored. Yet in direct contrast to these principles and freedoms of this country was founded upon, some of the largest companies in the history of the world, these big tech monopolies, have worked recently to silence or censor viewpoints, specifically conservative ones. The examples since you last testified in front of this committee are numerous. For example, Google censored Republican fundraising efforts in email platforms. Google on YouTube removed videos created by the Conservative Political Action Conference. Google altered search engine results related to an interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. In my previous job as AG, we filed a landmark lawsuit that exposed a lot of this, that's been amplified by the Twitter files and then subject of a lot of the hearings that are happening over in the House. What deeply concerns me is that you've spent the last 2 decades of your life pushing an agenda on behalf of these same big tech companies. The ties between you and these big tech companies are clear, numerous, and quite frankly, disturbing. Public Knowledge, the nonprofit that you founded in 2001 and served as its president, received $100,000 from Google, over $50,000 from Amazon, over $50,000 from Facebook, as well as hundreds of thousands of dollars from third-party groups connected to these big tech companies. According to public disclosures, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a foundation where you served as a board member, was one of the groups that received, and I quote, the most substantial contributions from Google's U.S. government affairs and public policy team. Your ties to Google were so tight that already back in 2007, Politico noted that you worked closely with Google on several policy issues. According to MANA, a national Latina organization, as a senior advisor to the FCC several years ago, you championed a proposal to let Google and other tech monopolies pillage minority programmers' television's content without paying for it. In 2020, you criticized my colleague, Senator Cornyn, and continue to push the big tech agenda by defending Section 230 liability protections for those companies. So my first question simply is, do you honestly expect the members of this committee or the American public to believe that you can be neutral with this long history and conflict of interest?
Absolutely. And let me say first, Senator, nice to meet you as well, that the FCC does not have jurisdiction over Google. I had to provide every single radio, television, and news article that I was quoted in for the last 10 years. You will see, particularly in the last 5 years, I have been as critical of big tech companies as you have. So my relationship with them back in the day when they were smaller, when they promoted policies that public knowledge agreed with, yes, we were on the same side. And talking about the money, we got money from everybody. I asked money from every company. We would get money from Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, DirecTV. So we were not partisan when it came to money. So.
Let me ask you, because you've mentioned that some of these claims are phony, and we'll get to some of that, and I may have to come back. But do you believe so-called disinformation should be censored?
I don't think the FCC should have any role in that, no.
But largely speaking, I mean, in this government, there has been a Ministry of Truth propped up, right?
Senator, I actually have a difference of opinion than some of my colleagues about disinformation, and certainly government should not censor it, no.
Well, let me just follow up briefly here. So in 2020, You specifically said that conservative bias on Facebook and Twitter those claims were phony. In 2016, a whistleblower at Facebook exposed that the company would suppress news stories, including stories about Senator Romney, Senator Cruz, the ranking member of this committee. Do you think that that claim is phony?
I'm not saying that claim is phony, but what I was tweeting about was the fact that there was a guy who would every week list the top viewed things on Google or the top topics on Facebook, and 9 of the 10 of them were conservative.
Okay, well, in 2021, YouTube suspended Senator Rand Paul after he pointed out that cloth masks were ineffective, relying on President Biden's own former COVID advisor. Is that claim phony?
Excuse me?
Is that claim phony, the fact that Senator Rand Paul was taken down because he claimed cloth masks were ineffective?
I don't think that's phony, but YouTube has a right under the First Amendment to do that if they want to.
Okay, and so here's what I want to get at. Let me just wrap up.
The senator's time has expired, and you're 1 minute over.
Okay.
And so we'll if you can stick around, you can come back. But we have
Happy
two
to.
other members.
You know, beyond some of the concerns that have been brought to light of the connections with big tech and some of these really inflammatory statements that you still have not apologized for, you've called them sharp. But I really find it astounding that you have not apologized for some of these statements, especially with regard to law enforcement. But beyond that, I wanted to explore your advocacy for massive economy-changing regulations like net neutrality. In my preparation for this hearing, I did go back and watch some of your previous exchanges before this committee. And in particular with Senator Lee and Senator Semina, you essentially said, and I think you've said it here today, that Congress should act on this issue, but if Congress doesn't act, then the FCC can. Now, since you were here last time, of course, the Supreme Court decided the West Virginia versus EPA case, which narrows rulemaking authority for agencies, including the FCC, on major questions of economic and political significance, of course, the major questions doctrine. And so I don't have a lot of time, so I want to ask you, because I am very interested in knowing, a couple of simple questions. First, do you believe that the FCC can implement massive regulations that would have wholesale restructure an economic sector, or massive regulations that are political or economically significant? Do you believe the FCC can do that?
Well, Senator, it's hard for me to answer that question without more specifics.
Well, what about net neutrality? I'm asking you specifically.
Let's talk about net. I think that's.
Well, I actually, so I've laid it out. I don't have a lot of time. Net neutrality, you know what that is, and you know what the major questions doctrine is. Do you believe you can act on that?
So the problem is that the Brand X case is a direct contravention of the West Virginia case.
Ma'am, I'm just going to ask you, yes or no, do you think you can act on net neutrality if Congress doesn't act?
I think the FCC can and has the authority to act. That doesn't mean it won't be challenged, and the West Virginia case is going to be a challenge for net neutrality rules.
But you see, you understand the importance of that case was a lot of bureaucrats will say, this is ambiguous, there is gray area. They have narrowed that down specifically so that, in fact, bureaucrats and regulators can't act on these sorts of issues without Congress acting, because it's a part of a broader structure here, right? The Constitution was created to make sure the people, the Article I branch, has these decisions because they're accountable. You can send us here and you can send us home or you can send us back. They can't do anything about you after you get past this hearing. And I've just asked you a question, if you think you can act on this, and you said you have, and you have no ability to do that.
Well, Senator, again, Chevron still is good law, and I've lived by Chevron and died by.
But Chevron has been modified. You would admit that, correct?
Well, you know, it hasn't been modified.
Well, then let's add another thing to the list of reasons why you shouldn't be confirmed. Because the EPA case makes very clear that people who might, you want to be in a position where you can do this. And what it appears to me is that regardless of what the law says, regardless of what now the Supreme Court of the United States precedent is, that you think you can act on issues of major and economic significance or political significance just because you're frustrated Congress hasn't. You see how that might be a problem, right?
I don't think it's a problem because the Brand X case is opposite. So the Brand X case says that the FCC has the authority to decide whether broadband is a telecommunications service and an information service, and that's kind of the crux of net neutrality. Now, whether the FCC could actually adopt net neutrality rules, I think that's a more difficult question, I'll be honest with you.
So on net neutrality specifically, in 2020, you said that the 2015 implementation of net neutrality order that then President Obama, it wasn't enough. You said, quote, "I'm not advocating for just reinstating the old rules." So even if the questionable legality of the constitutionality of your actions, your comments demonstrate that you actually want to go much further than that. And based on my review of your record, your statements, by the way, I was just referring to statements you made before. You've made very clear that even after the EPA West Virginia case, you're doubling down on this, that your willful ignorance of that ruling, I have strong concerns that you'll be unbiased, which I've indicated before, in an independent agency that has broad authority, and instead be pushing a radical agenda that you want. And I would submit to you that if that's what you want to do, you ought to run for office. You ought to run for the Senate. You ought to run for Congress. But I think you're trying to do an end around here by being on the FCC and getting what you actually want, which is not how this system was set up. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.